Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first IBA Stage event of the year. For those of you who are less familiar with the series, IBA Stage is an online series, which in which invited biennials have the chance to deliver a presentation of their most recent projects. The series was developed very much as a response for the impossibility of traveling during the pandemic time, but we realized that IBA could offer this as a quite important space for a dialogue and for a reflection over biennial that have taken place recently, even beyond this, and probably even more so when people actually had the chance of witnessing a biennial. And so I'm very happy that this series is continuing and it's slowly forming a core element of our programming at IBA. Now, before I introduce our guests this afternoon or tonight, depending on from where you're following, I just want to run through some basic house rules to make the event more pleasant and more easy to follow for everyone. And first of all, I want to remind you that the event is being recorded and it's also currently being streamed through our social media channels. And so let me also take a minute to welcome those of you that are following us through our Facebook Live and our Instagram Live channels. Thank you for joining. Now, in terms of rules, I think we're all quite familiar by now, but just to remind you that if you wish to speak, please use the raise hands button in your console, or of course, you're more than welcome to reach out to us or to our speaker through the chats, and we'll be either giving you the word or read out your question, depending on what you prefer. Throughout the presentation itself, we kindly ask you to leave the camera turned off, but you're more than welcome to turn it on when we get to the Q&A. On the other hand, of course, we do ask you to keep your microphone off at all times unless you are speaking, to avoid any conflicts, let's say. Having done all the homework, I am now very pleased to introduce Bige Örer as director of the Istanbul Biennial, which she has been director since 2008, but also as vice president of the International Biennial Association, of which she is a founding member. So welcome, Bige. It's great to have you here. I'll keep your CV very short, but I think it's important to underline that not only were you in charge as director of this last 17th Istanbul Biennial, but in the previous year you were also the curator of the Turkish pavilion at the 95 International Venice Biennial, with a sole exhibition of Turkish artist Füsun Ünlü, which, for those of you that have had a chance of seeing, was a wonderful and delicate presentation. And I will give you the word after quickly saying that you have a background in political science and as well as sociology, and of course a quite strong and long interest and an experience with biennials. So having said that, I leave you the floor. Thank you for joining, and we will reconvene after your presentation about the last Istanbul Biennial, which I should mention was curated, was curated, of course, by Meta-Bauer, Amar Kanwar, and David.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much for your invitation and also for this nice introduction. And I would like to also welcome everybody who has joined this dialogue. And we have also agreed with Christian that we would open up basically this platform to hopefully a dynamic dialogue rather than a monologue and like a presentation, more than a presentation. We hope to receive questions from the participants, and so that we can also share our ideas and our feedback is as the audience who have already visited the biennial. Maybe I see some names who are also from Istanbul, so I think that they have had the chance and the opportunity to visit the biennial. And I must also say that Christian has been following the Istanbul Biennials for a long time, and also allocating a lot of time and commitment to visit the exhibitions and meet with the artists and also with the team members. So he is very knowledgeable also about the Istanbul Biennial, additional to other biennials that he has been involved as a curator or as a researcher. So it's a really great opportunity for me too to reflect on what we have done, because sometimes you are so much in making things happen, and then you need some time to reflect on how it worked, where it didn't work, what could have been done better or in a more different way, and what we learned from this experience and from this edition. Basically, to start with, I'll also share with you a presentation just to remind together about some of the projects together, and then we can of course go back to these projects. As Christian said, I'm involved with the Istanbul Biennial since 2003, and as the director of the biennial since 2008. So I had experienced many biennials as basically as a team member or as the director of the Istanbul Biennial, which happened throughout challenging times, with the political and economical situation in Turkey, which has been fragile, which has been challenging. And but I must confess that this edition was the most challenging biennial that I have experienced in my life. Why? Because, of course, as we all know, it was a biennial which had to be realized during the pandemic period. And basically, it was a biennial where the curators were not able to travel to Istanbul for a very long time. The opening week of the biennial was the first time that three of them and we could meet together in Istanbul. And of course, we learned a lot, let's say, not sharing physical spaces and sharing this kind of more digital platforms. But at the end of this, let's say, 2.5 years, 3 years period, we also, felt once again how much we need to be together and how much we need to talk together in person, to look at each other's eyes and to really mean something by spending time together. So it's not only about organizing meetings to talk about the conceptual framework or the project of the artist, but it's also about spending time in Istanbul. It's also walking together in the city. It's also smelling things, tasting things, and it's a whole experience to make a meaningful biennial. And for the basically also in the history of the biennial, the city has been a very important character, let's say, an actor. maybe much more than many other biennials which are taking place all around the world. But Istanbul has been really the main character, I think, of the Istanbul Biennial. This is, of course, one of the reasons maybe is that the city has such an intense, historical, cultural history, richness, many stories, and also maybe due to the fact that we have been trying to engage with the city in one way or another in each edition. And also, as from the beginning, the fact that there has not been a permanent space, it allowed also us to be more fluid in the city. So to move from one space to the other, from one neighborhood to another one, and also to learn, for us, but also for basically local people who have been living in the city for so many years, to experience a space and then to remember stories. I mean, remembering stories, of course, can be sometimes really great and fun, but remembering can be also, painful. And today, I would like to remember Hrant Dink, and who has been assassinated 16 years ago, and who has been very inspiring for me and for so many people. And so Istanbul Biennial, I think, is also, has this role of remembering people, remembering spaces, remembering some, challenging political also issues through the dialogues that artists and other participants of the biennial are able to create together and unfold some notes, which have been difficult to swallow for us. And so, for this 17th Istanbul Biennial, before even we started working with the curators of this edition, we had basically these objectives of working on a sensible exhibition, which is aware of the ecological crisis that the world is going through. And as the Istanbul Biennial, we also see it as our responsibility and as our priority to think about the ways that we make things happen. So as a cultural institution, how can we also transform our exhibition making practices, our biennial making practices, to raise awareness about these issues, but also how do we change our actions? So this was a priority for us that we have been also sharing with the curators of the biennial. And we wanted to also highlight and celebrate basically also more non-Western artistic practices who are also, dealing basically with this, with the sensibilities and issues. So, so when we started working with 3 curators, which is a totally, a challenging decision again, 2 curators and an artist who share some visions, but who have also maybe different, ways of working. We also needed to, bring together these different voices, different ideas, and different, basically, priorities which would be meaningful in our context. So how to kind of support this more like situated curatorial practice in Istanbul, and how to make sure that these curatorial methodologies would be also engaging with the local communities and with the local issues, questions. So that was the main goal of this edition. And I mean, I will not go into detail about the projects, but you know, when the curators had proposed that this edition does not have a title, but it uses the composting methodology to bring together long-term research projects, long-term artistic projects. We thought that it could work, because maybe one single title and more like you know, a conceptual framework which is so precise would not have been able to share all the questions that we have been asking each other throughout the preparation process. And so, I mean, we took our time the first year just to also introduce some people, artists, not only artists, but also some, you know, academicians and some experts working in this fields from Turkey, to the curators, and to also some of the participants who have been invited, you know, back in 2020. And so we were also, you know, having all these discussions with the curators, how to also maybe change, you know, our usual ways of biennial making, which is challenging because, you know, of course, there's an institution which has this experience of almost 35 years, and we feel like we know how to make things, you know, in a good way. We know we have tested so many ideas, and so but of course this is an extraordinary time. So how can we really you know, find the right way of doing things, and maybe expecting some the fact that some projects will be invisible, some projects will, you know, start earlier than the physical exhibition period, but then continue after the exhibition. But how can we also make sure that we are able to, you know, communicate, talk about these projects in a city where, like, you know, 18 million of people are living, and how to reach out to exactly the different communities who can be interested in all these questions and debates. So so the idea was to focus on the process rather than the production. So we kind of postponed the production of everything till the last moment, which was again a crazy decision, but it was possible. And we also had to postpone the biennial from 2021 to 2022 because we felt like everybody needed more time, and we were not quite sure if, even if we had a physical exhibition, if the visitors would have been able to, you know, come and visit. Those were still the precarious times in Istanbul, where we did not know if, you know, tomorrow will be a more suitable day, or if things would go worse. And so, I mean, while talking about all these questions that we have been asking to each other, there were like some questions that the curators started also sharing with the participants. I say participants because there were not only visual artists who have been invited to this edition, but there were also some civil society organizations, some foundations, some academicians, and poets from Turkey who have been invited to this edition. So there was really like this need of finding a new language and a new way of sharing our ideas, our concerns about the system that we felt like, there's a major crisis, and how can we make sure that the biennial becomes a space to show solidarity and to give support to each other, to maybe center care, to put care in the center of the biennial making. And so, for example, one of the questions was, if the biennial is acting as a newspaper, and if the biennial can gather all these news from all around the world, and from some of the geographies where it's not easy to talk about some of the questions. And so while we were inviting poets to write a poem like every month, we were also asking them if they could become the news poets. So if what kind of news they would want to share from their personal or lives, or from basically their countries, their context, their cities, whatever they find that important as news. And then we have talked about ways of learning. So this, what modes of learning will encourage care and respect, also for humans, but also for the non-humans. And then we have been talking about more like archiving, unarchiving. So in this edition, we also presented a lot of projects which are dealing with archives one way or the other. And so how the knowledge of the past could be shared without being institutionalized, and what can we learn from the past also to talk about the future. And then we have been talking about elemental politics and geopoetics, to how can our lives and economies be rearranged to secure a healthy and social environment. This was one of the questions that many projects in the biennial responded. Then we have been also talking about sensory aesthetics. So how can a sound make us see, or how do smells make us remember? So there are like artists who work in diverse ways across the sensory divisions that limit our also intelligence. And then we have been also talking a lot about this ancient solutions, and how can we in a way cultivate love for the world, and how do we learn to apologize? How do we overcome violence and brutality that we feel we are surrounded with? So these were like maybe the main 6 questions that have brought together the projects in the biennial. But of course, there were more than those main questions. And And then maybe, you know, the main difference of this biennial from the previous editions was the fact that we didn't have a main biennial venue. In the previous editions, you know, entrepot buildings, the warehouse buildings have been acting as one of the, you know, main venues of the biennial, which we were able to host maybe a group exhibition of, you know, 20 to 30 artists, projects. And because of the volume of these spaces, around 4,000 to 8,000 meters square, you know, when a visitor, if a visitor is able to visit the exhibitions, then he or she would have an understanding, you know, a more broad understanding of also the conceptual framework and the general ideas of the biennial. But this edition has been scattered in the city in 12 locations. And, you know, there were like 3 spaces which have hosted steel group exhibitions, but then there were also spaces for solo presentations. And so just to give an example, Ghassane, which is on the Asian side, which is an old power plant station, has become a space for the physical exhibitions, but it has also hosted, you know, bread and puppet performances and some other outdoor activities, public programs, etc. And so in this edition, we also tried to bring together basically local contributors together with our international artists or participants. Just to give you an example, Fernando Garcia Dori, who has been in the Istanbul Biennial in 2015, who has, you know, made an extensive research at that time in Turkey and who always wanted to continue somehow this research. So, I mean, when we shared with the, you know, the curators of the biennial that it could be interesting to, you know, invite him back to Istanbul. And when we remembered this, his wish to collaborate with the Inland Association, who has been also working with, you know, Boğatepe villagers and Boğatepe Foundation in Kars. Things came out very beautifully, you know, and basically Inland Association and Boğatepe Foundation and the villagers have been really the main also creators of this piece together with Fernando Garcia Dori. And there were like other contributions, like cooking sections, who has been also, you know, working on the research for the last 3 years in Istanbul, and who has opened up a really great exhibition at SALT. And they also had this wish to continue, you know, their long-term dedication to the northern part of Istanbul, and just to see how the Ballowlands have been going through under violent transformation with the construction of the airport and with the, you know, all these urban transformation projects, which kind of limit the green spaces and also the, you know, the lakes and all this environment. We wanted to basically listen to them, how they would like to continue. And then, one of the outcomes of these conversations was the organization of a buffalo festival in Arnavutköy. And they also opened up a kind of a muhallebici shop in Tophane, where they were also able to sell the water buffalo products, but also talk about the history of the water buffaloes. And there was a researcher who worked on the songs which are written for water buffaloes all around the world. And so there were like local researchers who have been working on different topics on this issue. And we are really happy that our collaboration with cooking sections will also continue in the at least next 3 years, and we will be continuing to organize the Water Buffalo Festival and also continue working with the researchers. So it's not like once it's been done for the biennial and then it has disappeared, but we are also interested in like finding forms and ways of being more dedicated to some long-term projects. So maybe, I can just give another example of the dumpling post, that dumpling festival that we were so happy to collaborate with the Hrant Dink Foundation and 23.5. And basically a conference of the Hrant Dink Foundation, which was supposed to be organized in Kayseri, was censored. And then for the second time, when they planned to organize it in Istanbul in their space, it was also again cancelled. And so in one night, they decided to organize this dumpling festival. So if everything seems not possible, how do we respond? How do we create different strategies and tactics to combat with censorship and with authoritarian decisions? And so cooking together and talking around food seemed like the best strategy at that moment. And when we also shared our firm commitment to the work of the Hrant Dink Foundation and our will of doing something together with the curators, Amar Kanwar, who is one of the curators, he came up with this idea of why don't we also organize a dumpling festival together, and why don't we do a dumpling post, so that's a really nice, I think, way of creating, alternative solidarity mechanisms. And when we feel trapped, there's always a way to go out of this. So we have agreed with Christian that it will be a dialogue, so I have to stop, otherwise I can continue for the whole afternoon. But maybe, we can share some questions and then we can talk more about projects.
Thank you, Bige. I'm happy to join the dialogue, as you mentioned. And I think before asking you anything, I just was reflecting while you were going through the projects, some of them visually, others just mentioning them. I had another moment of realizing, and this has happened to me a few times while thinking of the biennial, while visiting the biennial, while thinking about it and so on, that maybe in comparison to other editions of the Istanbul Biennial, which I had the luck of witnessing in the past, this project really felt like a much more complex and interwoven project, or I even struggle to call it an exhibition, because I think it was like a very 360 rounded project that included the social commitments and solidarity to specific institutions in Istanbul, or to specific spaces. And every time I'm thinking about it, I'm realizing another layer of this complexity, And I think this is also something that, and maybe this is a question more to also the others that are in the audience to reflect upon whether that's just something that I felt, or if it's indeed, I think, a key component of this project, that it really managed to go beyond an idea of the biennial as a unitary exhibition and really build it into the fabric of the city. And I know that was not a question, but there is a question connected to this, which is, talking of fabric of the city, you already mentioned that for the first time, there was no such space as a central exhibition space. No, there was no one place in the city that people could recognize. Yeah, that's where you go to understand the biennial. It was instead a scattered exhibition that was happening throughout areas and neighborhoods that are used to have to being hosts to the biennial, and others that are completely new to this. And so you mentioned Gazane in Kadıköy, which is the Asian side of Istanbul for those that are not familiar with the city itself. But there was also this wonderful medicinal garden in Zeytinburnu, which is on the European side, but definitely not in an area that tourists would usually go to visit. And indeed, that was actually the space where you opened the biennial with the press conference and the welcome to the guests. And so I'm wondering, in particular, these two spaces as well, they are spaces that are not only out of the usual geography of the biennial, but they're also both run and owned by the municipalities in the city. And so I was wondering, you didn't just engage with new spaces, but you also engage with new actors in the city that are not that usually involved in the process of making a biennial. And so I was wondering a little bit if you could tell us how working on the one hand with foundations like the Randing Foundation, with spaces like independent spaces like Perform Istanbul, but on the other hand also involving the municipalities such as Zeytinburnu and Kadıköy, maybe also changed the way that you approach the project and what it did to the project itself.
Thank you, Christian. I mean, this is a really good question, because I think as the Istanbul Biennial, I see it as our responsibility to make sure that the biennial is owned by everybody. So it's not a biennial of a foundation, only of a foundation, which is organizing it, which has the responsibility of bringing things together. But how do we make sure that people from Istanbul, individually or institutionally, they also become the owner of the biennial? And of course, we have really so many collaborations with institutions, foundations, civil society organizations, universities, but also local authorities, municipalities, because when we are working in the public space, we have to have a relationship also with the local municipalities to get permission and everything. Basically, maybe because of the pandemic, we felt like we cannot be only in Beyoğlu, and we cannot ask people to travel from one place to another just to visit the biennial. So how do we make sure that the biennial is going into different neighborhoods? And it's not only with the with this 12 locations that we had physical exhibitions, but we also had collaborations with more than 50 bookshops, cafes, restaurants, hospitals, care centers, to distribute the ideas and to distribute some of the projects of the biennial. And we were always thinking about different forms and different forms of presentation a project can take. So, okay, we can, present it in an exhibition format, but what can we do more to make sure that even if people are not able to visit maybe that exhibition space, they can still have a way to, to experience it in another form. And basically, I think the collaboration with local authorities and municipalities was really important, because this herbal plants garden in for example, in Zeytinburnu, it's a neighborhood where more like the usual, biennial visitors maybe are not living, in that neighborhood. But the fact that one of the locations of the biennial was in Zeytinburnu, and we also organized our press meeting in this, space, I think, it also encouraged people from Zeytinburnu to also to go to other neighborhoods and visit some maybe other biennial projects. And so we kind of tried to open up, new spaces of gathering, new spaces of dialogue, new spaces of understanding each other through music, through performative events, through public programs, so through poetry readings and sharings, through some children's programs, and through some, programs that we have built around some of the publications that we were able to create together with some of the participants. So I think all these collaborations gave us also the chance to be in dialogue with, a wide variety of people, and also to understand what they are expecting from a biennial at that specific moment, and to test our ideas in a way.
Yeah, I agree. It felt like that. It's I think it's one of the many aspects of the biennial that really maybe was not immediately visible the first week, but that by engaging with the biennial for a longer time really emerged as key. And I think it's also important that you mentioned all the publications, all the other forms of manifestation that the biennial had, which of course are there for many biennials across the world. It's not something that we see for the first time, but really felt, I think the difference within this project is that they really felt a core element of the biennial. It was not just an additional part. And just thinking of your presentation, I'm struggling to focus on one specific question, because there are so many inputs and stimuli that I got, and of course I'm waiting for anyone in the audience to intervene as well. You're free to intervene whenever you want to ask something. But maybe one aspect that really struck me again now by listening to you, and that I think really connects with this idea of the composts and of the kind of slowly building a humus within which other things can emerge, and that is not organized and so on. One aspect that really I found very interesting was how many projects had a previous and will have a continuous life after the biennial, no? And in which you're capturing them in one specific stage, but as you mentioned with the Buffalo Festival project, they will have a longer life, also because they were part of the biennial. It's a project that cooking section started for an exhibition at Salt in 2020, just before the pandemic, that I saw in the middle of the pandemic in one of those awkward museum visits in which I was the only one and wearing a mask and so on. And then I had the pleasure of seeing revisited and enlarged and brought to life with the festival itself in Arnavutköy, as you mentioned. And I know that it will have it will continue its life after the biennial. Same with Fernando Garcia Dori's project that I know had a longer history, and this was just one manifestation. But also in other cases, like the presentation, and this is a different case, of course, but also if you think of presentations like the one from the Nepali Picture Gallery and the importance that having their presentation and the Women's Library in Istanbul together in one exhibition is also it's a testimony that there are connections, there are things that are born within the biennial but that have a longer life. Yeah, and so I don't know where the question is right there, but I think what I would like to ask is maybe all of these projects that have their own trajectory and that were part of the biennial that you were custodian of, in a sense, much more than a specific project that was built for the biennial and that disappears. Because you mentioned that it was definitely the more challenging biennial that you've been part of, I'm wondering also the choice of including all of these projects, how much it contributed to that being rewarding, but also complicated, of course, to deal with. Also in the light of, for example, the curators not being able to be on site for most of the project and so on. So I think I made it to turn that into a question, but correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's hard to tell, like how many projects will have a longer lifespan. But I can tell that there have been so rich dialogues, which have been realized prior to the biennial, throughout the biennial, and even after the biennial. And there have been so many ideas to think together how to continue and how to make things happen. I think some will be in more like not spectacular ways of presenting these ideas, maybe like more invisible ways of continuation, but then there will be also projects like the work of Maria Lukman, the permanent water pond in Zeytinburnu Medicinal Plants Garden, or like the festival which will continue even after this edition. So there will be some more like concrete examples and maybe more intimate encounters and dialogues which will continue. Yes, I mean of course the challenging I think aspect of this biennial was related, of course, to these really extraordinary times, the pandemic period, and also because it was a process-based biennial, and even in the beginning, the curators were like not even interested in making an exhibition, a physical exhibition. And then we, went through many discussions and debates that in Istanbul, it's important to have a physical exhibition. We are not in Berlin, we are not in New York, we are not in London, that for the visitors also, for the audience of the biennial, we also, believe that this real experience with the presentation of the ideas of the projects is still important, maybe not in another context, but in Istanbul is. And so I think finding the basic the forms of presentations for each project has been maybe postponed to the latest moment wherever is possible. So that has been challenging, for the biennial team to really make everything ready at a certain moment, at least, the things that can be ready. Also for the experience of the visitors, because also visitors have expectations, when they're in a space, they want to see, things. And so this was, I think, a kind of a negotiation, continuous negotiation between the biennial team, the curators, and the participants. But I mean, finally, everything unfolded in a really meaningful and beautiful way.
Yeah, I agree, and I understand the challenge, and I think we even had this discussion in other forums, in other occasions, and I see, and I think those of us that have visited see how challenging it can be to transmit projects that might not have a physical form, and in which the physical form really is just a representation of something that it's much wider and much more complex to present. No? And on the other hand, of course, you have all the archival works that have been presented as well, which is also in this case, of course, the question of representation and of display is a big question mark. So I can see that these were some of the challenges. Maybe I don't want to say to conclude. Let's see how things go, and if we receive any questions. But maybe a further question can be, and I think this plays into some of the elements that you discussed now, and its expectations of the audience, but not only of the audience, of the art scene, of the institutions, of the whole urban system almost, to the biennial, to be a moment of reflection, but also of celebration somehow, no? Of display that's I don't know. There are things alive, and the city is alive, and the cultural milieu of the city is alive. And I think this was maybe this year even more noticeable than in other editions, that literally the moment of the biennial was used by, I don't want to say hundreds, but it felt like hundreds of smaller and bigger institutions to join this festive moment, no? This moment of gathering, this moment of collectiveness. And also considering, and you mentioned that at the beginning, that it was not only a challenging biennial because of the pandemic, but also because of the ongoing economic issues that are plaguing Istanbul and Turkey overall, and the political uncertainties and so on. And so I don't know if this was a reaction to that, and I leave you also a consideration on this, but it really felt like a moment in which there was a reaction of the whole kind of cultural system of the city to kind of point out that it still exists, it's still present, it's alive and kicking, even though it's under strains, of course, and under stress. But I think it was it felt like that. I don't know if you had the same feeling. But,
I mean, I was basically very happy to hear after the postponement of the biennial that from so many people that they really miss the biennial, they really miss the biennial season in the city, where you run into some international maybe friends, curators, artists, and where you can have really interesting dialogues, and where you can also share, basically what you, together with all the artists, participants, and curators, have been working for such a long time. So I think for this edition, really, institutions, not only arts institutions, but also, for example, Uğur Mumcu Foundation, that also we collaborated in order to invite independent journalists to, to think about the projects of the biennial and to write articles focusing on one project. So, and they were able to create texts which are quite different from the, art critics texts about these projects, but how to also maybe talk about the biennial projects in with another vocabulary, and so there have been like so many interesting dialogues. For example, other projects, they did a publication, an edition of the Annex magazine that they have been working on for the last maybe 10 years. And after they became mother artists, they were organizing these close workshops with other peers, artists, curators from the field, and sharing how difficult it is to be in this art ecosystem, and how the art ecosystem is sometimes neglecting or ignoring or, pushing the artist mothers out of the system. And so I think this magazine that they worked on for this edition was very also powerful in order to open up these issues in our, not also in our local context, but also in the international context, and how to maybe push also the arts institutions to, have different policies to embrace, women, mother, artists, mother, curators, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So there were like other projects like Eva Egerman, who also worked on another publication on the issues of the crippled, the able bodies, disabled bodies, and so involving so many artists and activists and academicians who have been working on these issues in Turkey. So it was, again, I think one important moment, how to like invite as participants, as contributors to the biennial, not only as readers, but as also writers, as speakers, as makers of these projects. So have to really make this edition of the biennial together, have to open it up more, maybe more than also the previous ones, if possible, finding ways of doing this, finding new ways of doing this. So when Angela Ferreira, we made basically the installation of Angela Ferreira in Gassane, but we didn't want to just present the installation, but as she was also very willing to collaborate with the circus school from Istanbul to activate the piece, we thought that it was a great idea. So we, even throughout the biennial, we found new ways of involving people, involving initiatives, and also making their work more visible. When we worked on this project, what are the birds thinking? It's a project which seems to address children and young people, but it wasn't only children and young people, but also, all the caretakers, all the educational system, learning groups and initiatives, and thinking about the birds. It allowed us to think about so many other subjects that we were able to start the dialogue, yeah.
Yeah, and I think all of these reflections were quite visible, if one had, for those that visited, definitely. I'm giving the audience 1 minute to intervene if they want to. And of course, I also want to remind everyone, not just in the audience, but also those following us in the stream and further, that of course all the information about the biennial is visible at the site of IKSV, of the Istanbul Biennial, so they can follow a quite rich archive, not only of this edition but of the previous ones as well. And yeah, if there are no other questions, maybe I can finish with a very straightforward one to point out maybe the most challenging and the most rewarding moments of this edition, in a very simple way.
The most challenging maybe moment was the moment when we were thinking about if we should postpone the biennial or not. And because we always go through very challenging situations in Turkey. And there's always this question of, do we do it? How do we do it? And we always answered this question in a way that it makes sense to do it, and we have to continue. We have to make things happen. But for this specific edition, we really convinced ourselves that it was more rational to postpone the edition, and everyone needed that time. And we cannot act as if nothing is happening around us when everything is falling apart. We had so many, participants who have been going through difficult COVID times, like losing parents, losing, close relatives. And India was stuck for so many months. Our curator was sharing desperate news from Delhi every day, and also in Turkey it was the same. We had to live in our closed spaces for such a long time, and we said that we cannot act as if nothing is happening. We have to accept that, and we have to kind of adapt to it. So that was I think the most challenging moment, and the most rewarding moment is hard to say, but I think when we were able to come together with so many artists and participants coming from different geographies, and where we were like able to really meet in person and talk and make things together. I think that was the most rewarding moment, really sharing, things in Istanbul.
And I think on that very beautiful and hopeful note, hoping that it will repeat itself, of course, that moment, I want to thank you for participating, for bringing, for accepting to be to present the 17th Istanbul Biennial, and for all the work needed to make it happen in the first place. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for being here and for following us. And yeah, I also want to remind everyone to keep track of our both website and social media channels for the next editions, both of IBA Stage and IBA Conversations, which we haven't started yet, but we will soon in this year. So thank you very much, Bige, and
thank you.
Hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.